What keeps me walking with Jesus amongst the doubts? I want to share a few things that help me keep walking when I feel like I am sinking in spiritual quicksand. Now, this isn't a complete worldview. It's more a selection of some of my favorites. Most worldviews are composites of different ideas, like mosaics made up of different fragments. And whether we are Christian or not, humans are never totally consistent with a thought out and lived out worldview. We know in part and we tend to muddle through. And the way we live, whoever we are, is ultimately an act of faith. So we put the pieces together as best we can, but if the parts that we value are reasonable enough, then we can create a worldview that is sustainable even in the shadows when God seems absent. Former generations look for absolute certainty through language and philosophy. For me, that has significant merit, but it's not the whole story by a long way. So these podcasts are a personal description of what keeps me walking with Jesus, even when there are shadowy valleys full of doubts. My name's Jools. Welcome to Dechurched.com. I don't know about you, but I'm a strange mixture. On the one hand, I can live with ambiguity. It can create space for invention and imagination. But on the other hand, I like certainty. I would like to have truths locked down and sealed up with a nice bow. I miss the days of my youth when everything about my faith was simple and neat. I studied at seminary and went there with 10 really good questions, but came out with about 50 even better ones. I had learnt eventually that walking by faith means living with unanswered questions. And that's okay. And that's not to abandon reason, but to say there will always be more questions than I can answer. Sometimes, though, those questions can trigger spiritual crises. And I know I've faced some crises of faith over the years. Often when I have a challenge to my faith, I kind of let the challenge sit there. It might be a doubt or an experience of something that caused spiritual distress. It may be a person or even a community that have not lived up to my expectations. And that raises for me at times questions of where agape love actually is. But I let the questions sit there. I name them for what they are. They are questions, just questions. They are not answers. I chat about them to God, and I remind myself of some of the reference points I have. Sometimes all that's needed is time sitting with the darkness and the shadows and keeping on walking. I remind myself that I have walked through life with the Lord as my shepherd. If he leads me through the valley of shadow, firstly, shadows ultimately can't permanently hurt. And secondly, he is still leading me, even if it's hard to see him. I want to share with you over these 3 podcasts some of my go-to reference points when I'm in shadowy places. Let me just say before I get into them a couple of caveats. Firstly, this isn't a perfect argument countering all skeptics and all doubts that you might have. In fact, I can think of a number of arguments against what I'm about to say. I talk with atheists and agnostics the whole time. But these are the sort of arguments, the sort of frames of reference, as it were, that keep me going. And saying that they are not perfect is not to close down debate about them. I mean, let's talk, let's have a conversation. But it is a way of saying, well, these are my reference points. What are yours? How do you keep hanging in with Jesus? Maybe some of these will be a help to you. The second caveat I want to say is this. For some seasons of life, other ways of viewing the faith have been stronger. But for the last few years, the following have kept me going. Firstly, I remind myself that life is not about absolute certainty. Absolute certainty is a mirage in this life. Those who tell you otherwise are snake oil salesmen. There are many times when I have been in deep distress about God's absence. My God, why have you forsaken me has been a lived experience. The truths I held have felt tenuous, and the true one has felt absent. But I also know this, there is no certainty in other worldviews. The bold and strident atheist has still made a leap of faith, much as he would like to claim assurance for his way of seeing things. The sitting on the fence agnostic is still making a choice of a worldview of some kind or other. The worldview may be just implied by the life choices they're making and not boldly stated, but it is there. It is an act of faith. And so I come back to my own fragile way of seeing things in the dark and my own desires for certainty which never get met. And yet there is a kind of certainty that involves enough elements to keep going with. They are like ingredients in a recipe. You may not have them all, but you have enough of them to do something with. Enough of them to keep walking with Jesus. On their own they're so-so, but put together you can start cooking something. One of the key ingredients for me is rational thought and argument are part of the mosaic. As I say, I debate online frequently with atheists and those of other faiths all the time, frankly. And when you're in doubt about the reality of God, this isn't always helpful. Not because the reasons you have are that bad, but just because it can feel like hollow philosophical word games. Nobody wins. It's just oppositional. And for all your 15 good arguments for God existing or Jesus' identity or his resurrection, and I have those, there are really good counter-arguments. And each of the debates is like a rabbit warren of definitions and counterpoints and argument. A maze of words that gets you lost and often leads nowhere. But having said that, for the shadow times you will go through, it's worth knowing that there are some good reasons for faith. And we need to learn those. Particularly, I would say, the ones that resonate for you. They may not be perfect. They may be only in part. And they're not perfect, at least in part, because they're based in language. We're trying to follow a mysterious person called Jesus, not following a clever philosophical code after all. But there is still a space in human life for reasonable and worked out opinions. It's just not the whole story of what forms a cogent worldview. So, know your reasons for God from the great thinkers. They do have some value. But know also the truths of the faith do not collapse just because they don't feel as great as they once did. One of my go-tos is Pascal's Wager. This is a way of viewing faith that has copped some criticism from the likes of Dawkins and also some better philosophers in recent years. But all I will say is that Dawkins is a better biologist than theologian. The idea works for me. Here's how it goes. Blaise Pascal, writing a few centuries ago, paraphrased in my words, says this: if I saw no sign of there being a God, well, I'd settle on atheism. If I saw everywhere evidence of a creator, I would kick back and relax. But sometimes I see the evidence and sometimes I don't. This is so frustrating, and at times I feel very vulnerable. I really wish that if there is a loving God who is in control, it would be really obvious. So he states the problem. Sometimes it's obvious that there is a God and sometimes not. And to some people it's obvious and to others it's not. So what does he do? He says, firstly, hard attitude is important. Again, paraphrased quote. He has chosen to make himself known by those who earnestly seek him and to be hidden from those who aren't earnest. There is enough light for those who choose to see, but enough hiddenness for those who are atheists. Then he says this: take the risk of believing. This is called Pascal's Wager. Take a gamble, take a bet on there being a God. It's not often you hear a religious leader advocating gambling. Here's how it goes. You choose to believe in God because the benefits outweigh the risk of being wrong. So, if there is no God and you choose to live your life as a Christian, what do you lose when you die? Nothing, but you will have lived a good life. And if there is a God and you choose to live as an atheist, what do you lose when you die? Well, you risk losing everything. Pascal says, if you gain all. If you lose nothing. Gamble then, without hesitation, that he exists. Now, this is not a perfect, all-encompassing kind of argument for faith. This doesn't address the issue of whether we're talking about Jesus or some other religious or belief system. It's only talking about living your life as though there is some kind of God. But it works for me. If God exists and God is love, what better risk to take in life than to live under that rubric? You've nothing to lose and everything to gain. You might say, can't you be good and loving without God? And of course you can. But it seems to me that it provides a far stronger basis for meaning and love and purpose than, say, believing that life is a random collision of time and atoms. Living as though there is a God and that therefore there is lasting meaning to our actions of love seems right to me. It provides a grounding and a reference point that no other system can. Well, what do you think? It's not a perfect answer to all the issues that we face, but join our conversation in our Facebook community and let me know what you think. In our next podcast, we're going to look at some other reference points, including the person of Jesus and the place of personal spiritual encounters we have had, and other reference points for walking in shadows. In the meantime, thanks for listening. Don't forget to like us and join us on Facebook. My name is Jools. This is Dechurched.com.